Welcome to Glad You Asked. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions to the pastor here at Grace Point and for me to give you an answer. And so we'll be dealing with tough questions and probably quick answers. That's the goal. Today's question that we want to start with is, should parents spank their children? In other words, to spank or not to spank? That is the question. And so we want to spend a little time dealing with that. As you know, you are born a sinner, and that means also that your child is born a sinner. So they're going to do some things that go against your rules, against the rules of God, and so they're going to have problems just like you have problems. And so one of the things we discover in Scripture is the first institution that God created really was the family. And so parents have the first effort in restraining kids from being disobedient. And so that's where we get into the subject of disciplining, in particular, not just formative discipline, but corrective discipline. I think most parents would agree that their children need to be disciplined. The question is, how should we discipline our children? How should we correctively discipline them, and what's appropriate? As a father of 3 sons, I can tell you I've had to face this question like many of you will have to face, and some of you are facing now. And so I want to answer the question, is it okay to spank my kids? And so the easy answer is to say, I did. Like, I spanked my 3 sons. And matter of fact, I remember the very first time that our oldest son, Caleb, got a spank, and we were living in Decatur, Alabama. I walked into the bedroom. He was just a young little lad, and so I walked in. He had the toothpaste, and he was taking a pair of scissors and cutting up the toothpaste tube. And so that's when he got his first spanking. And I spanked him not because I was mad because he was wasting the toothpaste, but I spanked him because I think he was putting himself in danger of cutting his fingers off, being at such a young age. And so, I don't want to say to you, spank your kids because I did, because I don't think that that's the strongest way to get at it. My experience is I spanked my kids and my father spanked me, and I could say to you, hey, look how I turned out. But that's not really the goal, is to be like me. The goal is to be like Christ. And experience can be a good guide on these things, but it's not our authority in how we live as followers of Jesus. So what is our authority? Our authority is Jesus in the Scripture reveals the thoughts of God to us so that we can follow those. So what does the Scripture say about spanking? Well, obviously, there's no Scripture that refers to spanking, but there are Scriptures that refer to corrective physical discipline. And so I want to share a couple of those with you. I think that will be helpful in coming to a realization that we've got to correctively discipline our kids and how we should go about this. So first of all, Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24. He who withholds his rod hates his son. What an incredible statement, because it says, hey, if you're withholding the rod of discipline from your son, you're actually hating him. But he who loves him disciplines him diligently. And over the years, I've met many a parent and many a kid who said to me, I didn't really feel like my parents loved me because they didn't discipline me. And so they didn't say because they didn't spank me, but discipline is something that every kid needs. And they may not always feel like that's love, but as you grow older, you discover that discipline's important and it feels like love. So Proverbs 23, this is an important passage for us today, says, do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from Sheol, or the grave, or the resting place after you die. So don't hold back discipline for your kid. And although you strike him with a rod, he will not die. There's some debate on what the rod is. Some would like to think about it as just being a figurative element, that the rod is just the authority of the parents to discipline their kids. I think from this passage in particular, we see that it's not just figurative, because he's referring to, as Solomon writes this, striking the child. And notice he says strike a singular, and we'll talk about that in particular about when you do spank. But striking is not a plural thing, and so it's not like many strikes. And so you shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul. So you do good by them, and I would say through spanking your children. Proverbs 22:15 says this: foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. And so we see this recurring. There are other texts that refer to the rod. And so what we're talking about is spanking our children. The rod was used for discipline. It was a stick or maybe a scepter or a branch. And obviously, I think the Old Testament is very physical and not just figurative. And so I think that that's referring to dealing with your kids in a physical manner. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't discipline your kids correctively in other ways, but I think the context says, that by striking or one strike, that you are helping your child by disciplining them. So we talk about striking, we would be talking about in our culture spanking a child, that it can be good and productive form of corrective discipline. So I want to give you a couple of words of caution as you think about spanking your children. One is, the question is, should I spank my children? The question is not, should I beat my children? Beating is not the goal here. Spanking is what you end up doing. Hopefully, you don't have to do it a lot, but chances are, if you're a parent, you're going to get pretty frustrated with your child. So, word of caution, number one, spanking is not to be abusive. And so I would say spanking is not abusive if it's done correctly, but spanking can move into abuse if we're not careful. Abuse of a child is never appropriate and should never be done. And so you have to be careful in your relationship with anyone not to abuse them, in particular with those who are weak, like children. You should not use your power to beat or just hit a child. And so I recommend that when you if you decide and you follow through with spanking, that you should be hitting that fleshy bottom and not striking them in other places. That this is not, I think, what is helpful for a kid. And so at our house, we had what was known as the spanking spoon. I would have brought it today, but I just totally forgot about it. Not even really sure, since our boys are basically grown men now. But the spanking spoon was a big wooden spoon that you would get, somewhere, probably if you're finding kitchen utensils. It was wooden with a gigantic head on it, and we used that to spank our sons. The spoon was never used more than once. In other words, it was a strike, not multiple strikes for me. So when I would spank our children, my sons, it would sting and I would pop them pretty good, but I never injured my sons in spanking. If you're injuring your child, that's not what the goal is. The goal is to be corrective. And so I don't recall ever popping them more than once when they got a spanking. Now, they knew they had been popped, but it was always on that fleshly bottom, so don't be abusive. And secondly, don't do it in anger. So, many of us, we get angry with our children. And the problem with anger is we tend to, in our anger, go overboard. So your spanking has to come out of love, not out of anger. So it's important that you think about this as you think about correctively discipline your kids. We can over-discipline them even with other means of discipline, but when it gets really physical, in spanking a child, you can move from punishing them, correcting them, to injuring them, and that's never the goal. So that would typically happen out of anger, and so the scriptures are clear. We don't have time to go into all the anger issues, but to control your anger before it controls you. And so let me give you a word about procedure real quickly. I would call this the 3 Ds of discipline. So discipline your kids in 3D. When I was a parent and my kids were younger, I didn't have the 3 Ds written out like this. This is me thinking through what I did. And so let me give you 3 things to think about as you discipline your kids in just a procedural manner. The first one was detain. And so when the boys got in trouble, I would send them to their room. Typically that was at home. So they would go to a room where they would be detained. And I would tell them, hey, I want you to go in that room. I will be there in a moment to deal with you. And so it was during during that time that they were detained, they knew what was coming, but on the other side, it gave me an opportunity to calm down. And part of that procedure was, once they were detained, I would have to walk and go get the spoon in order for the spanking spoon to come back and to deal with them. So they were detained, and during that time of detainment, I was able to calm down, think through how I wanted to go through this. And I think that's very important in the process of disciplining your kids, because we can tend to get out of control if we're not careful through our anger. So the second D in this is discipline. So then I came into the room. They were in the room by themselves, came to them, and then I would have them turn around like my dad did. I always wondered why my dad got me to face the bed so my legs were up against the bed. Well, once you spank a child, you know, because one pop and they're trying to run. And so if your legs are up against the bed, they can't move. So I pop him, then got his attention, and so we would go through the discipline with the spanking spoon, and then I would tell them to sit on the bed. I would leave the room, so they're still in detainment. The discipline has been meted out, and so then I would go put the spoon back up, and then I would walk back and open up the door to the room, and then we would have the third thing, debrief. So it's detainment, discipline, and debrief. The debrief was important to the discipline, and I would even say probably even more so than the spanking. So I would come into the room. They would be sitting on the bed. I'd sit down with them. When they were really small, I was able to pick them up, and put them in my lap, and we would talk about what would happen. And the most crucial thing for me was that they understood why they were getting disciplined. And so if your kid doesn't understand why they're being disciplined, that's not really helpful, because it's not corrective. So we would have a discussion about why they were being disciplined, and they would have to articulate that back to me. And so once we got through that process, I would hug them, tell them I loved them, and then I'd say, this is over, let's go play. And so we would get through that moment after the debrief. I would add this: if I were to go back and be, a parent again, I would do the debrief the same, but one of the elements I would encourage you to add into it is getting your kids to admit they're wrong and ask for forgiveness. And then that would help them not only understand that they've gone through this, but also get them used to seeking forgiveness from people when they've done wrong. And so this is the way that we would do it. So it's 3D discipline. It would be a detainment, a discipline, and a debrief, with the debrief being very important. Look, spanking should never be done out of anger, and you shouldn't ever feel good really after you do it. You've heard a parent, or maybe your parent said it to you, this is going to hurt me worse than it's going to hurt you. And you would say, not really. But in reality, when I look back at that first time that I spanked Caleb, and all the times that the boys got in trouble and we went through this process, it was always tough for me. And I think that's what parents mean. I don't think it hurts more, like obviously physically it doesn't, but I think there's a sense that you don't enjoy this process. And as you go through it, you come to realize, I don't enjoy the process of corrective discipline, no matter what it is, whether it would be a timeout or some sort of restriction. But corrective discipline is not fun for anybody, but the fruit of it is in particular good, and that's what you're going for. Because God gave you as a parent, as a father and a mother, the opportunity to restrain evil in your children, and so we want to take that opportunity. And so the answer to the question is, spanking is a way that I think the scriptures say that we can deal with our children. It's not the only way, but it's one form of corrective discipline. I would remind you of Hebrews 12, 5 and 6. Let me read this to you real quick. This talks about our relationship with God, and as God is our Father and He is our parent, He deals with us as His children when we've been adopted into His family. And this is what the scripture says in God dealing with us. It says, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, and not be weary when reproved. And in particular, looking at verse 6. For the Lord disciplines the one that He loves. He chastises every son whom He receives. And so God disciplines us because He loves us. And that's really the goal in spanking if you feel like that's the direction God would have you use in corrective discipline. But the goal of all corrective discipline is love, and to help us as children of God and our children to grow and do what is right before the Lord and before people. So to encourage you today, I pray for you as a parent. If you have any questions, we would love for you to send in some questions that we can be answering over the next few weeks. As the weeks go on, any question that you can send, I can't promise to get to everyone's, but if you'll send in a question, we'll try to do one of these a week, and we'll be glad that you asked.